Thank you, Anna. I told her not to embarrass me, but she has. And thank you, Sandy and the team and everybody for inviting me. I've had a very interesting day so far. It's probably going to go downhill from now, but partly because, as my wife will tell you, I'm not a visual person, and you'll see that I haven't got wonderful PowerPoint like many of you have had. I'm a text person, as it were. But I've learned a lot about the visual dimension of things today. I've also learned a lot about working with young children. One thing that Anna didn't mention, and which is still important to me, is that I began my professional life as a language teacher of French and German in a secondary school, in fact, in an upper secondary school. So my young people, they didn't like to be called children, were 13 to 18-year-olds. And then I went to university and started working with postgraduates. So that meant, people 25 and up to 55 and even beyond. So I don't know much about little children, except as a father and grandfather, of course, but that's not the same thing. I'm quite aware of that. But I'm also very impressed by what I've heard today, and I would really like to congratulate you all for the people in the team and in the project. It's an impressive project in many ways. One way in which I find it impressive is that it's very demanding on teachers. But teachers are professionals, and teaching is not a job, it's a way of life. And in that sense, it's correct and proper that there should be demands on us, and I include myself. And unfortunately, I'm going to make some more demands in what I have to say in the next few minutes. But I'd like to, I should have mentioned also two people, Manuela Wagner and Melina Porto, whose work I'm drawing upon this afternoon. And then I want to mention some other names. It's a happy coincidence, if you like, that there's a Braunschweig connection. Braunschweig was one of the team, as it were, because Braunschweig also meant a lot to me. And Peter Doyer was a very good friend, but he also taught me a lot, particularly about primary education. And he was the one then who also introduced me to Gerhard Himmelmann, who was professor in Braunschweig as well, working on citizenship education, or as he called it, Demokratie lernen. So I really want to mention those two names before I get started properly. What I'm going to try to do in the context of ICEPELL is to ask some questions. There won't be many answers. There might be one or two, but there won't be many. It's for you to find the answers, not for me. I'm going to try to do that by looking at kinds of citizenship, and definitions and descriptions, looking at citizenship in particular as an activity, and then the whole question of making choices and taking risks, which was in my title. And perhaps then particularly looking a bit more in detail at the distinction between teachers' choices and learners' choices. You'll see then that I'm beginning at the beginning. I'm not taking anything for granted, but a lot of this, particularly at the beginning, and maybe all of it, you'll be familiar with. But I do want to begin at the beginning. And as Alice said in Wonderland, begin at the beginning, go through to the end, and then stop. I thought I would get an answer, but no. Okay, so let me start then with kinds of citizenship. There are three dimensions according to Osler and Starkey. They talk about citizenship as status, so legal status, the passport that you carry, the identity papers that you carry, or indeed that you don't carry, that you don't have in many cases in our contemporary world. The second dimension is what they call feeling, the sense of belonging, the feeling dimension. I've added the word identifying there because, as will become evident, is important in what I want to say. So the sense of belonging with a nation and or state. I'm not going to go into the distinction between nation and state this afternoon. That's for another time. But we're not talking about nation states. We're talking about nations or states and states. The third element is the one I want to focus upon most, and which you've been focusing upon most, and that's citizenship as practice. And again, I'm quoting Osler and Starkey, where they talk about acting usually together with others. I've put the word usually there, but that's there. Those are the three dimensions of citizenship. If we then take that third dimension a little further and look at citizenship as acting, then Banks has got an interesting four-level notion of citizenship as acting. First, there's failed citizenship. There are people in the world who are not recognized by states and or nations. And for them, citizenship is failure. And if anything, if they can act in any way, they have to do it for themselves. They have to think about their own situation. They're not recognized in the state in which they find themselves. Stateless people, in other words, on refugees and so on and so on. At that level, then, action is for the self, Banks would say. The second level is one that I hope and trust everybody here has, that is a recognized status where we have rights and we have the possibility of participating in our state and in the place that we live. But this level of citizenship, although it can involve participation, doesn't always. And where participation is then not necessary or not carried out. Let me just briefly say something about that. I'm working in France at the moment, and my conversation recently has been with someone who is very worried about the very low participation rates of 18 to 30-year-old people in voting. And they've had quite a few votes in France recently, as you know. He's worried about that because he would argue, and I'm more and more convinced he's right, that participation in one sense, and in the sense that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, is fine, but if it does not lead to, or if it goes alongside with no participation in the political life, voting at the very least, and everything that goes with voting, then we have a problem. Then we have a real problem in democracy. So participation is one thing, political participation is another. That's just in passing something for us to think more about. The third level, according to Banks, is what he calls participatory, where people do take part and are active as citizens in their state. And then the fourth level is the one which interests me most. That's why I've put it in big letters. What he calls transformative participation, where that participation has the purpose of changing things, transforming things, usually, he would argue, within the limits of what is legal, within the concept of human rights and so on. But he also points out that there have been famous people, Martin Luther King and other people he mentions. This is an American writer, but we could think of people in our own states, people who have broken the law, in inverted commas, or at least the law at the time, and have acted illegally in the narrow sense, but have then transformed society, and that then has become a legal, looking back as it were, a legal action. So transformative participation is the highest level that Banks mentions. The problem is that his work, and many people, only talk about citizenship within the national framework. And I think it's important to go beyond that. We need to go beyond the national framework, and that's where the notion of intercultural citizenship and acting as an intercultural citizen becomes relevant. We contrast it then with a national framework where there might be transformatory participation, but it would still be with our, meaning our country, our nation, our state. What we've done over the years in Durham and beyond is to try to go beyond the national framework, taking from foreign language education an orientation towards the international or the transnational, whichever word you want to use at the moment. And secondly, think in terms of how identification can be created and is desirable beyond, not instead of, but beyond identification with one's national or state identity. So that is taking things from foreign language education, and then we took things from citizenship education theory, some of which I've just mentioned, the notion of participation, transformatory participation, and action, and then action in the world, and that our now refers to far more than our state, our nation, our country. All of that perhaps is familiar enough. But let's also then link that with the ICEPELL project. Here is a couple of quotes that I've, quite long, but I've picked out the key words that I found on the website. Modern citizenship education is no longer about being able to convey knowledge about political institutions. This is a quote from, as you can see, a quote from the EU or the European Commission. Instead, and I find that instead problematic, it should be it's also, not instead. The problem with this is that it says, forget knowledge and just focus on skills. Well, that's nonsense. But instead, as a school subject, it can focus on developing competences related to effective and constructive interaction with others. Okay, we've known all of that and seen a lot of that today. Thinking critically, which we've also seen today. Acting in a socially responsible manner, which we've also seen today. And acting democratically. And I'll come back to democracy later. The second quote is more directly, I think, from the project itself. Intercultural citizenship education focuses on intercultural communicative competence, civic action in the community, resulting in connections with a more global world beyond the local community and country. For example, on a European level, and maybe on a world level. We'll see. Again, that's something we might come back to for this time. So that's citizenship, defining and describing, familiar ground, I'm sure. But then that notion of citizenship as activity is highlighted. It's highlighted in the ICE guide, and I'm not going to repeat everything there. It's there. I've highlighted the activity 4 in the different levels and the different activities and stages that we've seen illustrated in the presentations today. And again, you've seen this already today of the circle of activity, including number 4, take action. So citizenship as activity, and I've got one more just to remind you of the connections with everything that has been done by people here, but of course there are many people here and in the bigger, wider world to whom the ICEPELL project is still relatively new, so I won't apologize for telling you what you already know, some of you. And there again, there's that word activity. I'm not going to read that, but it's there, and it's very clearly part of what you're doing. I'm going to show you one of our projects briefly, because of course I had to prepare this in advance, and it would have been nice to use one of your examples, but I'll use this as a way of just highlighting what I mean and what we mean, and I say we, that means the Durham Network and other people, about activity. Now this is the end product of a project. It's in Spanish, so I'm sure that you can all understand that. Somebody tells me it means that you must separate out your rubbish for the sake of the environment. We will help you if you need our help, and words to that effect. My Spanish is non-existent. And that we've been working with people in Denmark. That's what it says there. That is a banner which was across the street outside the school, and the children involved were 10, 11-year-olds roughly. That's, if you like, the end stage. And I'm not going to go through all of the rest of it. It all can all be read in one of the books that is also, I think, mentioned in your documentation. The title, Green Kids, Young Learners Engaged in Intercultural Environmental Citizenship. But I do want to emphasize the main characteristics of this, which again is very evident in what you've been doing, that students from 2 or more countries collaborate, and in particular, there is, in the course of the project, evidence, small bits of evidence, of how the children begin to forget their Danish and Argentinian national identities and start thinking of how we, and the we is never defined with a label, so they don't call themselves we world citizens or something like that, but nonetheless in that they are, in a sense, we world citizens, how we can do something. And it's that extra level of identification that we were interested in our work. What Hosler and Starkey called the feeling level, or the feeling dimension. The other important dimension of what they did in the course, before they got to that final product, was to analyze their taken for granted beliefs. I've heard the word the phrase taken for granted today already. It's a phrase I cannot translate into any language that I know easily, except with a paraphrase. But it's an interesting phrase indeed. It's what we just don't think about. It's just obvious, or it's just natural that we do these things. And the cultural becomes natural or naturalized. But then that naturalized way of doing things gets challenged by interaction with people who have another naturalized way of doing things, and that then leads to a denaturalization of what has been naturalized. And thirdly, the students engage in critical thinking and taking action. Again, this is all part of what you've been doing. But the students in this project were getting very much involved in their local community, outside the school, and becoming rather critical of what was being done inside and outside the school with reference to recycling and matters of the environment. And they learned, for example, that what is recyclable in Argentina or in Denmark is not recyclable in Argentina, and vice versa. Categories of what is recyclable change across the Atlantic in this case. And the fourth element of this is to emphasize that the citizenship is the content. These were English lessons, as again you've been describing today. And again, the question was raised, I think this afternoon in one of the presentations, or after one of the presentations. What about the language gain? Well, I think what we've got here is a transfer of CLIL, content and language integrated learning, which normally takes place in biology lessons. In other words, we use English to teach biology or geography or whatever it may. And there's, of course, as you know, a lot of work and research and sound evidence that helps in language gain, or language competence, if you will. And we just transferred, without thinking too much about it, but retrospectively we think, well, we've transferred into the language classroom some of the principles of CLIL. And maybe we should look a bit harder at what the principles of CLIL are and make sure that we're gaining from those principles as much as we can. And then secondly, there are themes of social significance in this. I mean, after all, the environment is a socially significant, but in other projects of this kind as well. So themes of social significance is an important characteristic. Sonia's project was very similar, and I put this in very quickly this afternoon, and thank you to our colleague and friend in the technician who has helped me to do that, because there was the taking action. cleaning the streets, and that really interesting idea of interviewing the street cleaner and interacting with him or her. I don't remember if it was him or her, but it could just as well be her. And then she also mentioned, and others mentioned in the course of the day, parents' reactions. Well, parents' reactions were good, were positive, but it is a non-controversial topic. There aren't many, I have put a question mark, but there aren't many people today who would say that we don't have a problem with the environment. There are some, of course, but not many. So it's not a really controversial topic. But if you start going into controversial topics, then you might have to make some harder choices. And that takes me to the third dimension of what I wanted to say, about making choices and taking risks. On the one hand, teachers' choices, and on the second, learners' choices. Again, I've hastily put in something that was mentioned by David this morning, which I hadn't picked up when I read the guide originally. This notion of disquieting elements is, I think, connected with what I want to say about choices. And then, again, this is just a quick summary, or not summary, but I've shortened a quotation from the ICE guide. These disquieting elements prompt discussion and can lead to subsequent projects of civic action and engagement. Okay. But it also, this dimension reinforces the responsibility of the early English language learning classroom for engaging with problems of our time. That's the notion of controversial or important societal issues. And again, it goes on to say this transformative approach to ELT highlights the role of the engaged citizen in making a difference in local and global communities. So we're on the same page. We're singing from the same hymn book, as the British military like to say. But what about choice now? What's going on here? Choices are going to have to be made with respect to action and with respect to content. Let's start with content. If you take seriously the characteristic of that project on Green Kids, that the themes should be of social significance, then, of course, like the environment, and it's not surprising in a sense that our Green Kids project and your project took to the environment. It's a relatively safe area. But if you look at other themes of social significance, then refugees was mentioned this morning. I would add the word religion. That hasn't been mentioned today, as far as I remember, and I think I was listening most of the time. But those clearly are themes of social significance, and those are not so easy and not so non-controversial as the environment. Is this then a matter of teacher's choice or pupil's choice? Can pupils make choices? Well, I think, again, we've heard that they can and do, and your project showed that this afternoon. But I am using the word pupil here, not student. I'd still make a distinction between pupil and student. I know that the Americanized English, they talk about students all the time, even if they're only 3-year-olds. But for me, a pupil is someone who is, to use the Latin, in statu pupillari. In other words, they're children. They are not yet adults. And there are different issues involved when you're dealing with children than when you're dealing with adults. I'll come back to that. And then there's a question of making a choice to take critical thinking and action seriously, to encourage or maybe require. I don't know what you've done, whether it's been just sort of, well, I think in some cases the pupils, the children were volunteers, as it were, in an experiment. I think I remember somebody saying that this afternoon or this morning. But if they're not, is it required? Is it simply what we all do because we're doing this project together in this class, in class 3, 4, or whatever it is? If that's required or explicitly or implicitly, then it seems to me we've got to think hard about what that means. We have to, at least you have to, according to your website, stay within the law, at least. That was the phrase, acting in a socially responsible manner and acting democratically, from the quote that I heard earlier. So I'm not talking about encouraging your children to break the law, yet. So, is it a teacher's choice or a learner's choice? Well, let's think about, first of all, about these matters from the teacher's perspective with respect to content. What do you do as a teacher? It was clear that in some of your projects that there's discussion goes on. Does the teacher contribute to the discussion or not? Well, this is not new. This is not rocket science. There are usually three approaches, as it were, three stances that you might take. The first is to say, well, as a teacher, I remain neutral. I don't say what my view of whatever it is, the environment or whatever it might be. I'll just remain neutral. That's a stance that can be taken, but it's actually, I would say, in a sense, self-deceptive, because it's very difficult not to be a teacher. And if you're a teacher, you're an authority figure, whether you like it or not. So it's very difficult to maintain neutrality. The second option is what is in the literature called balance, where the teacher acts as chair in a discussion and maybe as a guide to make sure that when rhetorical texts, I'm using that phrase, or rhetorical texts both in the sense of written texts, but also rhetorical texts in the sense of the way people talk. Now, this is perhaps more sophisticated, I don't know, than your 6 and 7 year olds. I don't know, you know, I don't. But if somebody says, surely it's this, that, and the other, then of course we've got a rhetorical text. And not everybody notices that they're being manipulated by that surely. So for me, it's the responsibility of the teacher with their skills as a teacher, and particularly their linguistic skills as a teacher, and you're all languages people, also to take that into consideration as a guide in reading or hearing rhetorical texts. And in this situation, the teacher expresses their own views, but makes it clear, these are just my views. I'm just one person in this debate. That's a little bit more open and a little bit more feasible and practical than simply saying I'm neutral. But you're still an authority figure. We have to be aware of that. You are still, as Berger and Luckman, anybody heard of Berger and Luckman? The social construction of reality. But you're all significant others, as Berger and Luckman said. And that significant others is something that has an impact upon the situation, and you can't avoid that. But it's perhaps less self-deceptive and less difficult than trying to be neutral. Then there's a third dimension, commitment, where you say, I'm not going to try to be neutral, I'm not going to try to be balanced, commitment is the name of the game. Commitment is what we do as teachers. For after all, we are responsible, and that's my key word, of course, in all of this, we're responsible for learning and for transformation. And so I'm committed to doing something which will change these young people, these children. What do we mean by transformation? There are two kinds. On the one hand, I as a teacher want to change my learners. That surely has always been what teachers do, in the sense of I want them to learn something, even some knowledge. I know that knowledge is now, as we saw in that quotation, sort of put on one side, but at the very least, and indeed a lot more than knowledge. But I want them to change. So in that sense, I'm responsible for transformation of the learner. But what is new in what we and you are doing is saying, I'm also, and I put it crudely, I'm going to help, maybe even use these learners to transform society by making them transformatory citizens. And they may not be transforming or changing much as 6-year-olds, but we saw that they can do things, change things around them in the examples you've given, change the attitudes of parents to the environment and so on. But if we're successful, then these will be young people who, when they do vote, and I hope they will vote, will begin to be transformatory in a much more substantial way and change society. And it certainly needs changing. Just a smaller personal view. So transformation of learners in the sense of learning, in the sense of intellectual and affective change, developing their potential is fairly straightforward. But when we transform our learners into agents or people with agency, then we're going much further. And we're doing it now. Because what you've been doing and what we've done in our projects is think of our learners we think of them as citizens, not just as denizens, not just as people who live in the society, but they're already citizens. It's not when they grow up that they become citizens, they are citizens now. And we think of them as transformative citizens, and we think of them as transformative citizens who may, but that's perhaps a step too far, may become lawbreakers when the laws are wrong, according to Banks. However, again, I repeat what the EU says. This is an EU project. We better be careful, right? We better stick within the law, and we better stick to democratic practices. But what about the learning, the transformation from the learner's perspective? Now, this is again where the age factor and pupils as opposed to students becomes significant. And I've got just questions now, because as I said, I don't know much about young learners. My first question was, can young children, or pupils to be more precise, decide the curriculum, what to learn, and how to be transformed? Again, I think we've seen that your project says yes to that question. I can remember from the 1970s. In Denmark, there was a law, paragraph in the Danish law, education law, paragraph 4, subsection 2, I used to teach these matters, which said that children, from the moment they start school, must have the right to decide their curriculum. And why not? But I don't know if it's still the case, I hope it is. The second question, can children decide to take transformative action within the democratic or beyond the democratic limits? Can they make those decisions to take transformative action? The third question, are children, as children and not adults, are they entitled to take transformative action? Because they're not yet, in the view of some people, citizens. But I think in our view, they are. But that's a question which has to be answered. And I think that's something that has to be thought about and discussed. Then there's the question of informed consent. Still part of the notion of learner's choice. Informed consent is a phrase which comes from research. And from a lot of discussion in research, which you may well have been involved in yourselves, the usual thing is, will you give me consent? Will you be interviewed? Will you carry out? You carried out surveys. I wonder if you asked for their consent. Probably not. But when you have to carry out a scientific survey, a public survey, and so on, then it's normal and routine to talk about informed consent on the part of those people who are going to fill in your survey or answer your questions or talk to you in interviews or whatever it may be. And that consent must be informed. In other words, they must know about what it is that you're going to do with the data, and they must, in principle, know what it is that the project is about. They must be informed, and they must have the right to withdraw at any point. That's the usual discussion and discourse about in the world of science and ethics of science. However, the problem with informed consent with respect to learning is, how can you know what you're going to be like once you've been changed? So can we ask our students, as it were, or our pupils in your case, I'm thinking of my students, but you can think of your pupils, can we ask them for their informed consent? Well, or can we ask their parents? Parents is the same thing, really. Can the parents know what you're going to do to their children? The only answer that I can think of, that we can think of, Melina and Manuela and I, is that somehow you've got to make people as informed as possible. But they won't know what you're going to do with them until it's been done. And what's been done cannot be undone. So that's the only way we can think of with respect to informed consent, but it's an important issue. It's a lot more important in this new kind of teaching and learning than in the teaching and learning. As I said, we've always tried to change our learners, but we've tried to change them in the sense of giving them more knowledge and change their attitudes and whatever. But now we're sending them out into the community to do things, to transform society. And the background to this is all that work on critical pedagogy, which in a sense, and again, it's not the time to go into that in great detail, but those people, and some of them are Marxists, who will say school should be an agent of change of society. Well, it's a big and an old question, which we won't go into just now, but it's the notion that students can and do sometimes change society, or at the very least try to do so. There's a book which I will mention to you by a man called Ron Barnett, who wrote a book called Higher Education, A Critical Business. And the frontispiece, the first thing you see is a photograph of Tank Man. That was in Tiananmen Square all those years ago. Some of you weren't born at the time, I know. But who stood in front of a line of tanks and stopped the line of tanks. He becomes the symbol of critical transformatory action for Barnett. That's the furthest that we could and should push our students, whether we could and should push our pupils to that kind of transformative critical action. That's for you to think about. But it's the spirit of 1968, which some of us can remember. It's the spirit of Tiananmen Square and everything that's happened since then. In that background, students, which I work with, are adults. And students make their own choices. We're never going to give up our position of authority entirely, but students are adults and make their own choices. And back to the question of age and pupils as opposed to students. Can pupils or children become socially responsible and, there's a word missing there, that was a quote from me earlier, and democratically active, or whatever the word missing is. Can they become, according to your website, socially responsible, democratically active in that furthest dimension of critical transformatory action? I don't know. You're the teachers, you're the experts, primary. I only have grandchildren. Then there's a question of risk, and I must move on, especially for young learners. If we're going to send them out into the world, and if we're going to deal with controversial, socially important topics, then there are matters of risk, even in the content. And in the United States, where Manuela Wagner works, they're very keen on this notion of trigger. I thought it was something on a pistol, but it's the notion that you make sure in advance, as far as possible, that the learners know that they're going to deal with a topic, a content, which is controversial and may offend them, or may be problematic for them, or their parents, if you're going to think in terms of consent and informed consent through parents rather than children. So that is one way of trying to think about dealing with risk with respect to controversial and problematic issues. Of course, there are other risks in the classroom that you're all familiar with, so I don't need to, but it's of this order. This is part of the context of risk. More importantly, in our projects, is when you send them out into the world, into the community, beyond the classroom walls and beyond the school gate, there are risks involved in that action in the community. Risks which we're not perhaps familiar with, haven't thought as much about in the past as we need to do in the future. What do we do there? Well, again, all we can think of, Manuela, Melina and I, is that you simply just, because you cannot know what's going to happen if your children go out into the street and start talking with the street sweeper or with other people. What's going to happen? There could be all sorts of, difficult situations. We have to risk that and try to reduce the risks. You can't have risk-free life. But perhaps there's also the importance of being able to opt out on the part of the learners and on the part of their parents, if you think that it's their parents who should be deciding. But we do have pedagogical purposes for all of this sending them out into the world. So maybe we can also involve the students and the pupils. You can see I've still fixed in my university mode, but whether it's pupils or students, we can involve them in the risk notion. And rather than just taking responsibility or handing responsibility to the parents, make them aware of and make that part of the process of taking action in the world, thinking about the risks, the decisions they're going to have to make. Scaffolding is a word you're entirely familiar with. But those are your decisions, I'm happy to say, not mine. And this language teaching. Well, today, I had to prepare this in advance, and the question really hasn't come up today, at least only very tangentially, but it's a question which does come up often in all of this. Is this language teaching? This is the sort of thing I've heard many times. I'm a language teacher, not a social science or a citizenship teacher. And in the same vein, as a language teacher, my job is to see that they improve in language competence, that there's language gain. The second one I've gone to answer earlier by saying, well, think of in terms of CLIL, and there's enough evidence in the research on CLIL to say we can be sure that there will be language gain. And indeed, in some of our projects, that's been looked into in an informal way, but it's been looked into. So that's okay. But teacher identity, I'm not a language teacher, I'm not a citizenship teacher, many people will say, but I've heard the phrase, I want to broaden children's horizons, more times than I've had hot dinners, as the phrase goes. And you heard me drop my H there, didn't you? Hot dinners, I said. You didn't notice, but I'm very conscious of it. Because I'm Yorkshireman, and in Yorkshire we drop our H's all the time. That's just a personal, no. The point is, as a teacher trainer or teacher educator, when I interviewed many young people over many years, why do you want to teach languages? Why on earth do you want to teach languages in England where nobody wants to learn? Because they all think that English is spoken everywhere. Why on earth do you want to do it? And I got always two answers. The first one was, I thought, rather trivial, because they'll be able to get up, grow up and grow older and get a job in Europe. Well, after Brexit, that's no longer true anyway, but it was never true. But the second answer was always, I want to broaden children's horizons. And that's a perfectly valid educational purpose. The only problem was that teachers in those days, and when I was working in teacher education, didn't know how. They did things, but it wasn't very systematic. So in that sense, I would say what you're doing is what language teachers want to do, and what you've done, and what I think we've done as well, is help language teachers to be more systematic in achieving that very noble aim. But the answer, after all, is again your choice. But one last caveat, because it's time for me to stop, one last caretaking matter. I heard the phrase this morning from somebody about how the work might be valid in and beyond Europe. And I hope it will be. But action in the world and action in the community and making choices is something that we can do in democratic societies. We are lucky still in that respect, and it's certainly not the case everywhere. So we have to take that seriously, and well, maybe you will interact with people, and maybe there are people watching us now from countries which are not democratic, and we have to think about how they can work on some of these matters as far as possible, as it were. So I have no conclusions, only questions. There they are. Should teachers make curriculum choices or pupils? Can children make choices? Should you transform pupils without their consent? Should you instigate societal change through pupils as citizens? And that's a very sensitive topic. Are we using children, in inverted commas, but only socially responsibly and democratically? How do you deal with risk? And are you only a language teacher, or are you a language and something teacher? My head of department used to write me emails and he always wrote as briefly as possible. So he would write something and say, "What think?" So I had to think about what I thought in response to what it stuck in my mind. And Isaiah Berlin is someone I like to quote. He said, when asked about something, what do you think about democracy or whatever it would be? And he said, I don't know what I think until I've talked to you about it. So let's talk. I've got some bibliography which I'm sure will be made, you can't read, but can be made available to help us think about these matters and talk about them. And I think there's 5 minutes for us to talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael Byram, and I was taking lots of notes as usual. After all these years, I'm still learning from you, and I hope my students online are as well. I was advertising your talk and announcing it will be online. Sorry about that to my students. Are there any questions for Professor Michael Byram? Let's hope they're easy questions, not the difficult ones you've asked.
Easy questions.
What informed consent can we as teachers guarantee that pupils or students will be transformed as part of our teaching? I'm not sure.
With reference to informed consent, that means?
With reference, right. Guarantee that they will be transformed. Or I can pass you the microphone.
No, it's okay. But I can't,
So,
I can't read it. With reference to informed consent,
can we guarantee that our students will be transformed as part of our teaching?
well, the answer to that is no, of course. We can't guarantee that, but you're all good teachers, so yes, you can. It's a matter of what do we mean by teaching, and I think, well, we never know. One of the first lessons or points made in philosophy of education is that teaching does not necessarily lead to learning, and learning does not necessarily need teaching. But in the happiest circumstances, then teaching does lead to learning. But what kind of learning and so on, well, we don't know. And what we would all, or what we should all do, and what we have tried to do in our projects, and I think you've also done to some extent in your project, is evaluate. I mean, you've talked today about what you take away from your projects, and there are more systematic ways of evaluating, and that's also another project, almost a kind of scientific way of evaluating. And to answer that question, then we really need to evaluate our projects. But it's easier said than done, and it needs, to do so properly, needs another project on top of the project that you have.
Thank you. Then there are some comments. One refers to how learning can be two-way when it comes to citizenship education, because we need to be open and learning from our children as well. And a question asking, how can we create transformative critical thinkers if we cannot take up risky, controversial topics because we need to stay in line, etc.? I don't know if the teacher or the participant who asked this question is Portuguese, because in Portugal we do have citizenship education, and it is a compulsory subject right now, so we would be addressing the curriculum. Yeah. But I understand that sometimes...
Well, I can understand the question, yeah. I mean, I can understand the question that... and this is risky ground, of course. As soon as you go beyond the environment as a controversial topic, we are in risky ground. I think the answer, as far as it's possible, I don't know about Portugal, but in principle, it is a matter of informing and working with, above all, the principal of your school, or your head teacher, or whatever you call them, and whoever else is in authority. In principle, teaching should be risky and should go into topics which are controversial. If your curriculum, whoever you are in Portugal or you in wherever you are in the world now, if your curriculum says you must not do that, then I don't have an answer. It is, of course, as soon as you move into controversial matters, there's a fine line between teaching and indoctrination. And those three levels of teacher involvement to the point of commitment should not be indoctrination. But the answer to any critique or criticism of what you're doing is to say our main, anyway, a great element of what we want to do is make our students critical. So our students should be challenging us just as much as they are challenging society. Now again, whether a 6-year-old will challenge you, I don't know. You know them better than I. But I know that 16-year-olds will. So in that sense, I've no fears about indoctrination. They won't let you indoctrinate them in the schools that we know and love. However, in some countries, that's not the case. I'm fully aware of that. So there's no simple answer to these questions. As I said at the beginning, all I have is questions, no answers.
Thank you, Mike. And I think the other question has to do with this issue. And even though in Portugal we have citizenship education in the curriculum, as you may be aware, those of you who have been reading about this in Portugal, it has become a controversial issue in itself because some parents have understood it differently. So one of my future projects would be perhaps on citizenship education for parents, because I think often parents imagine all sorts of things because they are not in contact with the school that much, and they imagine all kinds of terrible things happening with their children's minds, and so that should be addressed, and they should be invited to participate as much as possible.
Well, and the example we had where the parents had given positive feedback, very positive feedback, is just the first step. Then maybe the next topic is a little bit riskier, or something a bit more controversial. And if you build up the confidence of parents in that way, then maybe that's the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael Byram. Thank you.